And I'm delighted to introduce Sean Burkholder, who will be introducing the panelists and the topic. We decided that it would be more fun since we kind of have a local panel here, and Tessa, in fact, is back on Wednesday for our students. We'll hold the conversation so that you can talk to them individually amongst yourselves, and we can get a little time to breathe and relax before our next speaker at 7. So I'm going to invite Sean up to the stage to take it away. Thanks, everyone.
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for your physical and mental fortitude making it this long into the day. Welcome to the panel described as the naturalists. In Design with Nature now, or Design with Nature, McHarg established the naturalist as this idealized type of straw man. In this case, a person or a group of people who believe solely on the laws of nature, and that, to quote McHarg, that all meaning and purpose can be inferred from the operations of the biophysical world, and that it is in here that they all search for an ethic, unquote. McHarg's naturalists were also characterized by their commitment to understanding humans as inseparable components to the natural world, albeit with special particular levels of agency. Their understanding of the world around them was based on a belief that all life was interconnected, an idea that has seemed to predict this, of course, happening in 1969, kind of predicting the propositions of Lovelock and Margulis in the following decade, and the much more recent, what is termed non-human turn in theory now. But back in the 1960s, maybe even in jest, McHarg was critiquing the naturalists based on their kind of lack of humanism. And so even though all of that said, McHarg's naturalists actually became the types that led the environmental revolution and transformed our understanding of our place in the natural world today. Our group of discussants today are all kind of in different forms, their own forms of naturalists. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say. Today we have with us Sally Willig. Sally teaches field ecology both here at the Weitzman School and in the Environmental Studies program, with the aim of getting students out into the field to better understand ecosystems, processes, and patterns. Her teaching and trips to the field have been fundamentally transformative, I know because I talked to these students, to an entire generation of landscape students here in the program. Jared Farmer studies the histories of built and unbuilt environments from the hyperlocal to the planetary. His temporal expertise is in the long 19th century. His regional expertise is the North American West. At Penn, Professor Farmer is affiliated with the History of Sociology of Science graduate group, the Religious Studies graduate group, and the initiative in the history of the built environment here at the Weitzman School of Design. And lastly, Tessa Desmond is a research specialist at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She also directs the Seed Farm at Princeton, co-leads the Princeton Food Project, and serves as the co-PI on the Heirloom Gardens Oral History Project. Her areas of interest include seeds and stories, histories of agrarian thought, agrobiodiversity, sustainability, regenerative agriculture, and food sovereignty. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, and so I do apologize that order in terms of presentations was incorrect, and we're going to begin with Jared. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Catherine. You've invited an historian to your birthday party. Happy 100th, and you'll get from me what historians give, communion with the dead and evocations of their past. Yesterday, I went to Van Pelt, third floor, to the shelves that house the collegiate yearbooks and course catalogs, and I found this depiction of the class of 1924 and a companion image from the 1925 yearbook which notes the arrival of a new course in landscape architecture taught by Robert Wheelwright. I also found out yesterday, as an aside here, that this Ivy League university actually had English ivy growing on its buildings, just like Princeton. I can't imagine that's good for the serpentine, a poor building material in the best circumstances, which is probably why ivy now comes in shapes like this. So ivy is a plant, ivy is a stone, an idea, an institution, a structure of power. So really, ivy is the perfect subject for a naturalist. Like any good word, naturalist has many meanings, including obsolete ones and some strange bedfellows. So I'll go backwards now. Strange bedfellows. In philosophy, literature, and the visual arts, the word has specific connotations, but the dominant meaning since the early modern period relates to the study of natural history. In the golden age of the naturalists, when natural history was science and science was natural history, figures like Goethe, Humboldt, Thoreau, and Darwin studied everything: life, nature, democracy, the cosmos. But by 1900, with the emergence of ecology and other academic fields of science, the naturalist lost stature and relevance, becoming an amateur, a hobbyist, a club member. In the mid 20th century, various American writers tried to bring back the naturalist as a figure who bridged the scholarly and the popular, and also the sciences and the humanities. Rachel Carson and Joseph Wood Crutch are important American examples. One of the most successful mid 20th century neo naturalists was a Penn professor. He's come up. Here we go. Loren Eiseley. With the editorial assistance of his wife, Mabel, he wrote numerous eloquent books that combine science, philosophy, literature, history, and memoir. The Eisleys were doing creative nonfiction before that genre had a name. The Immense Journey, a bestseller from 1946, opens with an homage to the rats of the Paleocene. The 1970 book, The Immense Pyramid, included naturalists in the subtitle. That same year, of course, witnessed the first Earth Day, with Penn and Philadelphia and Ian McHarg playing star roles. When McHarg used the word naturalist, he had a different meaning than Eiseley. He actually meant ecologist, that is, a politically conscious human ecologist. Why he didn't call this rather weird chapter in Design with Nature the ecologist is frankly a mystery to me. Now, the DP is not necessarily the best source on the history of Penn, but it has been fully digitized with really good search function. It's fun to play with. So I can tell you that the first appearance in the DP of the word ecology came in 1901 in a notice about the Botanical Club. The first appearance of the phrase human ecology came in 1935 in context of a talk by a professor of geography, a department based in Wharton. The first mention of the phrase ecological planning came in 1967 when your department received a large grant from the Ford Foundation. Yesterday in the library, I looked through the bulletin to see how your department described itself over the decades. The word naturalist never appeared, as far as I could tell. The first full-fledged description of the program came in 1953, after Martin Meyerson joined the faculty. Landscape architecture is a social art. Its practitioners offer those services whereby the Earth's surface is molded for human use and enjoyment. Compare that to 2 years later, 1955, after McHarg joined the faculty. When the creation of shelter includes an appreciation of the quality of human experience, building becomes architecture. When the disposition of plant materials, inert materials, and water in landscaping includes an appreciation of the quality of open space, horticulture becomes landscape architecture. Now, clearly the 50s were a time of great innovation for your department. Here's the revision for 1959, by which point McHarg was chair. One of the most conspicuous failures of 20th century Western society has been the environment created. Squander and anarchy are more accurately descriptive than efficiency and delight. This should cause no surprise when we consider that prevailing values esteem the ephemeral consumer product over landscape and townscape. Indeed, the new yet obsolescent automobile or refrigerator are much more highly prized than the enduring social and physical environment. Despoliation of landscape and the accretion of ugliness are inevitable consequences of such prevailing values. Fast forward to 1970, Earth Day is here, Meyerson is university president, and the politicized meaning of ecology is dominant. And here's how your department described the program. It's really something. I wish Penn were like this today. Through constant repetition, we have accepted the prospect of 300 million Americans living mainly in the great wens of megalopolises covering 1/10 of the land area of the United States. We have accepted as the mode of growth the extension of the status quo, accretion of more hot dog stands, diners, gas stations, auto cemeteries, split levels, sagging wires, billboards, concrete and asphalt adding annular rings to existing centers until they coalesce. Slums are increasing faster than they are being replaced. We have the assurance of distinguished epidemiologists that cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, neurosis, and psychosis are urban epidemics. If one examines the face of man-made America as a product of conscious choice, it would appear that we preferred a dilute soup of dead bacteria in a chlorine solution to clean water, an admixture of lead, hydrocarbons, and carcinogens to our air, selected beautiful rivers for dumps, junkyards, and sewage disposal, and had formulated a national policy for eradication of natural beauty. It would further appear as if anarchy and ugliness were the criteria of excellence for our cities. The automobile was preeminent over man. Open space in cities was a positive evil to be eradicated, and God's own junkyard, the chosen symbol for our time and society. In the search for the scientific basis of capital L landscape architecture, this department holds that ecology, and this is where the word first appears in your course descriptions, is the single integrative science which permits both diagnosis and prescription. Louis Kahn, the most perceptive of men, foresaw the ecological method, even though these intractable, inert materials, which he infuses with life when he spoke of existence will, the will to be, this place is because. It is and is in the process of becoming. This we must be able to read, and ecology provides the language. It's like, wow. That's all I can say, wow. Okay, so finally we arrive at 1982. I think at this point, McHarg is about to retire. This is a little before Anne shows up. And this is where the professional voice of the financialized corporate university, the pen we know and love, printed this in the bulletin. The Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning is regarded widely as the pioneer of ecological planning and the major center for its continued development. A survey conducted of departments of landscape architecture concluded that this department held national, perhaps international primacy. Okay, but let's backtrack to 1970. The first Earth Week in Philly featured an ecology action bus tour of Philadelphia's so-called pollution trail, and culminated in Fairmount Park with speakers like Allen Ginsberg, Louis Mumford, and Ian McHarg, with music by Redbone and others. I assume the bus tour included the refinery complex. This is a picture of Point Breeze from 1970, showing the PGW plant and the north yard of Arco. And here's an aerial from 1975 of the same. Tasker Homes, a Philadelphia housing project, is right there at the fence line of the freeway and refinery. In April 1970, Nathan Hare, a sociologist at San Francisco State, published an anti-Earth Day article called Black Ecology. Hale wrote, "Blacks and their environmental interest have been so blatantly omitted that blacks and the ecology movement currently stand in contradiction to each other." He argued that ecology, by which he meant environmentalism, was in effect white ecology, as in the concern that water pollution disrupted water skiing. He made a dig at redwood trees, a picture of which, by the way, appears in the chapter The Naturalist in Design with Nature. And in his contention, white ecology aimed at the hearts and purse strings of industrialists and hit the eyeballs of the white bourgeoisie. Drawing on Fanon, he asserted that the real solution to the environmental crisis is the decolonization of the black race. Blacks, he said, must challenge and confront the very foundations of American society. In so doing, we shall correct that majority which appears to believe that the solution lies in decorating the Earth's landscape and in shooting at the moon. Marvin Gaye's classic song, Mercy, Mercy Me, from 1971, could be read as an attempted consilience of white and black ecologies. But it's noteworthy that the 1970 Earth Day in Philly attracted very few black participants, as reported by the Philadelphia Tribune, the city's historic African American newspaper, which quoted the leader of the Black Economic Development Conference, who charged that the anti pollution movement was a deliberate attempt to distract public attention away from institutional racism. I'm struck that when today's intersectional activists protest at Penn, they do so, or at least they did so, before this academic year on College Green. The green didn't exist as such until the bulldozing of the Black Bottom and the creation of the beautiful neo-brutalist barrier known as Van Pelt Library. 1962, Meyerson Hall here. 1967 completed the northeastern barricade, and Locust Street could become Locust Walk. The urban university could now gain a quasi-suburban green thanks to faculty here in design. Just a few weeks ago, you may have noticed, Penn Police installed the classiest no camping sign you've ever seen under a tree in the style of the architectural signage on campus. The largest, grandest, most beautiful tree on the green is this one. And you can see it's grown a lot since 1924. This is actually from 1924. And there's the tree. I circled it. There it is, the spirit of Pennsylvania. This is, in fact, a very historic tree, or at least it's a scion of a tree purported to be a witness to something historic. The so-called Penn's Elm or Penn's Treaty Tree memorializes an event that may or may not have taken place. Nonetheless, this organic landmark by the Delaware River became one of the most important monuments of the early republic. And when it died in 1810, the trunk was turned into a museum display, and the stump was replaced with an obelisk, the original obelisk in Philadelphia. Plant material from the original has been propagated ever since, and clones thrive throughout the Commonwealth, including at Haverford College. Our treaty tree was planted on Arbor Day, 1896, in a ceremony with the governor and the chief of the Forest Service of the United States. The chief remarked that the American people had made just two, historical mistakes. One moral, one economic. First, the treatment of the Indians. Two, the degradation of the forests. I wonder what W.E.B. Du Bois thought of all this. The elm was planted here on campus the very same academic year he held his single-year non-renewed appointment at Penn. Even though other memorial trees have been added to College Green, including this one dedicated to Judy Ronan, you can see the security guard there. The era of monumental trees, a 19th century tradition, is not really legible to today's students. When they protest, they focus on the Franklin statue, not the Penn tree. Only a naturalist would notice the tiny sign on its trunk marking this specimen of Ulmus americana as the treaty tree. The sign exists because the whole designated collection of trees on our campus has earned accreditation as an arboretum, which requires such signage. Taking the astronaut's view of McHarg's Naturalist, who again is really a human ecologist, we can see that Penn's West Philly Arboretum is only 1 mile away from the city's vast treeless zone. The refinery complex, a site of calamitous pollution and trauma, a property that is currently being converted pell-mell into a logistics facility. The plans for the so-called Bellwether District do, if you zoom in, include trees among the many parking lots, but I'm not sure that this molding of the Earth's surface meets any generation's definition of ecological planning. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today as a part of the celebration of 100 years of the Landscape Architecture Department. So I'm going to see if I can get started here. What I really want to do today is convey to you how much I've enjoyed being a part of this department for many, many years, and how much I've enjoyed getting to know the students. And um, so I'd love to start with this photo. It's one of my favorite photos. I think it really shows the energy and enthusiasm of the students, which I think is really a big part of the essence of the program. So this is the Shawmont Waterworks. It was part of a grand structure that stood on the eastern side of the Schuylkill River, just above the Flat Rock Dam, and water was pumped from that slackwater pool up to the Upper Roxborough Reservoir. When we visited there in 2010, it was a ruin, and the students loved the ruin, and in a year's time or so, it had actually been raised. So I'm glad we caught this moment in time. Earlier today, Anne was talking about her involvement in the program and how when she was a student here, they went out into the field. So that tradition has continued up to the modern day. And we use the changing geology of the region, as she alluded to, these different physiographic provinces as the framework for locating sites. And as you move from east to west, the geology changes quite dramatically. So I just wanted to highlight some of the trips we've been going on over the years. I've been teaching now for many years with Marie Hart, a graduate of the program, and we really have a wonderful time. We teach a series of field trips. We do 2 weeks of the Summer Institute for 2-year and 3-year students, and then we do a fall semester with the 3-year students, and then we go back out in the field in the spring for about 5 days with the 3-year students as well. So I just want to highlight some of the trips over the years. This is back in 2012, towards the end of October, and we visit Island Beach State Park, and we make our way at these sites along different environmental gradients. So we go from the Atlantic Ocean side over to the Barnegat Bay, essentially from high energy to low energy. In this particular day, we had no idea that within a week's time, Hurricane Sandy would hit this area with terrific fury. So here the students are beachcombing as they make their way across the island. This is the backside of the island, and again, it was an eerily calm day, literally the calm before the storm. This is back in 2015, a more typical sunny day at the beach. We shifted it from October towards the beginning of the semester, and Marie and I always like to capture the students jumping. This was a particularly exuberant jump that day. And this was the next year. The enrollment was so large that we had trips on Tuesday and Fridays. So this was the Tuesday trip. Again, sort of an overcast day, very pleasant. The seaside goldenrod is in bloom. And three days later, on that Friday, it was a completely different day. There were 40-mile-per-hour gusts. It must not have been as bad in Philadelphia, otherwise I don't think we would have gone, but we just made the decision to really embrace the experience. So we crossed from the interpretive center over to the beach, and we walked a fair distance down and really had the opportunity to experience firsthand the important process of sand blowing across the beach, salt spray, and we could see it being deposited on the dunes. We crossed over a little further down, and we made our way to the salt marshes on the backside, and the back bays were flooding, and people were relatively well dressed for the day, but it was quite an amazing experience. So on this particular trip, we decided to go up to Seaside Heights, which was made famous in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. That's where the roller coaster fell into the ocean, and it was featured on a People magazine cover. And again, we just sort of embraced the experience. Okay. On the western side of Barnegat Bay, there's a peninsula that juts in, and that's where Caddis Island County Park is located. And over the years, we've been visiting there and watching this inexorable retreat of the living freshwater swamp with rising sea level and periodic inputs of salt from big storm events. So the freshwater swamp, dominated by Atlantic white cedar and sour gum, has been slowly moving inland. Its diverse shrub and herbaceous layer transitions to a continuous cover of common reed. So it's quite a remarkable thing to see. And we're seeing this all up and down the coast in the coastal plain. Marie does a really fantastic drawing exercise there where she has students do a blind contour drawing where they simply look at a tree without looking at their paper for 8 minutes. It's very hard to do. And then they do a regular drawing where they look back and forth, and it's really fascinating to see the comparison. That sets us up for our next trip to the Pine Barrens, a remarkable region of quartz sand. And for many years, we did the 6-mile kayak trip down the Batstow. But here we are at a beach. This is in 2010, where the students would draw and get a sense of the changing plant communities from high to low. I love this photo. This is Kenny Tang looking over his shoulder, drawing in the Atlantic white cedar swamp. Things have changed. We can't access the boats from that location during the midweek, so we've shifted over to mixed canoe rental, and we go down the Wading River. It's about a 3-mile trip. Again, we pull out at this sandy beach, and students are able to explore the higher, drier areas, the lower, wetter areas. They draw, they have lunch, and they have more fun just getting into the water and really immersing themselves in the landscape. It's a wonderful way to see the Pine Barrens. This past year, just a couple weeks back, the 2-year students did Summer Institute. We didn't get a trip in because of Hurricane Debbie, so we took the students who were able to come on a Saturday. And then this is the group just a couple weeks back, the 3-year students. And Harrison Hale is our TA this year, and I just want to highlight him. He's here in the front. For a number of years, we haven't been able to have a TA go in the field with us, so it's really nice to have a TA. He's in the 700 group, so it's a little bit easier. We then moved to the intercoastal plain physiographic province, characterized by different bedrock types. However, there's a small outlier of the Kirkwood Formation that caps Mount Holly. It's has ironstone, so it's more resistant. And so we go to the top of Mount Holly. We were just there yesterday, and students have an opportunity to explore, draw, and capture the vegetation. And we start to look at the soils. So we have a nice oxidized sandy soil there. And this is Marie, the fall of her first year in 2008. And we were at the Rancocas Nature Center. That's underlain by the Marshallton Formation, a glauconite-rich sediment. And as best I can recall, she was the only person who did her drawing in plan view. Most people do it, in cross-sectional view. So just a hint at Marie's tremendous creativity. So she directs the drawing and the representation, helps students to assemble field guides, and I just want to acknowledge her tremendous contribution to the program over the years. We have a wonderful time together. And in 2011, Hurricane Irene came in right at the start of the semester. It continued on up and went through the Adirondacks in Vermont, was very destructive. And on the heels of that, Tropical Storm Lee came through. So that happened to be the day we were visiting the Rancocas Nature Center. So here we were down in the floodplain, and I've never seen it as inundated as it was that day. So hopefully you're recognizing some of the folks in these pictures as your instructors. And there's a wonderful tidal freshwater marsh. Again, we were just there yesterday. And at this time of year, the wild rice is dying back, but the showy burr marigold is in perfect form. So this is a number of years back, but we had a very similar experience just yesterday. So then we move into compare and contrast the coastal plain and the Piedmont in Philadelphia, a fall line city, and our go-to site for many years has been FDR Park. This was around COVID, so it was optional for students to come out in the field, and Chris was our TA, and he rode his bike down here, I recall. So a couple of views of FDR Park. This is another visit to FDR Park under a beautiful lace bark elm, Chinese elm. And then we contrast that with the area up around the Horticulture Center. So we're up on the Piedmont there. Again, we caught this around the time the cherries were in flower. And this is the most spectacular overlook of the city. This is right by the Belmont Mansion in West Fairmount Park. So we're up on the Piedmont here, and in the background is Center City down on the coastal plain. From there, we visit the Piedmont, which is varied, and here's a site we've been visiting for a number of years now. The Piedmont sites are typically a comparison of contrasting bedrock types. So this is Nottingham County Park in western Chester County. It's designated as a National Natural Landmark. And at this time in 2017, Lindsay Falk was accompanying us. And Lindsay was a wonderful person in the program. As many of you know, we miss him very much. And he would talk about materials. So here he's talking about, we visited a Serpentine church that was there, and we were on shifts in the upper left, and then over to the right is the is on Serpentine, where there's a Serpentine pitch pine forest. And Lindsay would talk not only about the materials, the stones or the wood, he'd also talk very much about the people who extracted those materials and worked those materials, and just a wonderful individual who was very important in this program for many, many years. Ringing Rocks County Park is a very obvious site of contrasting bedrock. There's the rounded boulders of diabase that overlie these planar beds of baked shale called hornfells. So this is a really physical site for the students to visit, and they have to clamber over the rocks. And so their writing assignment for this one is to talk about how they perceive the site through their different senses. And again, just a couple of just recent students coming through. I want to share, at this time of year, everything's in fall foliage and quite beautiful. And then the last fall trip is up to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which sits on the first prominent ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, underlain by quartz sandstone. And there's a kink in that ridge here. So this is the students at the South Lookout, looking down at the river of rocks, where rocks have tumbled down over time under the influence of gravity. At this location, we typically hear from an intern talking about their work with raptors in some capacity. Sometimes they're domestic, sometimes they're international. And the students often use their watercolors here to capture the beautiful fall foliage. And then we go up to the North Lookout, which is where really a lot of the bird counting takes place. And then there's the option of going down to that river of rocks. So here are the students going over the edge and scrambling down to the river of rocks. On our way, oops, linger there for one sec. This was just last fall. And then this is the River of Rocks, really a spectacular spot. Many years ago, we actually looked down to see a mother bear and two cubs crossing, a healthy distance downslope from us. And that concludes what we do in the fall. And I just wanted to share two sites that we've been visiting over the years in the spring. And again, Anne had mentioned going from the Pocono Plateau down to the ocean and bay. So we go to Island Beach State Park for the ocean. In the spring, go to the Delaware Bay. This is the road out to Moores Beach. I learned about this from a student in the MES program who worked for the Delaware Bay Nature Conservancy Bayshore office. So Moores Beach was a coastal community, and it was abandoned. Many of the Delaware Bay communities have been abandoned due to sea level rise. So we walked out there in May of 2012, and you can see the road is in terrible shape. And when we got out there, this is the first week of May, it was spectacular. This is when the horseshoe crabs are coming in, spawning, and shorebirds are coming north from the southern tip of South America, and the Delaware Bay is a critical stopover point for them to fatten up on the horseshoe crab eggs before they continue to their Arctic breeding grounds. They close these beaches the week after, it's like the second week of May, so we're able to just get in a quick visit the very first week. And this is Diana Gruberg standing on the stoop of a dwelling that was part of the community that once stood there. So Hurricane Sandy hit that fall. It never occurred to me that we would have any problem when we went back there the following spring. So we showed up there the next spring. I just wasn't thinking. And there was a steady stream of dump trucks that were bringing sand from the local sand mines out to the beach, which had been restored because they wanted to get sand on the beach for the horseshoe crabs. So one of the fun things about the trips is there are always these serendipitous encounters. Who should show up while we're there but Dr. Larry Niles on the left and Dr. Amanda Day on the right. And they were worked with the state, for the state in wildlife. And they had been instrumental in the effort to fast track getting sand back on these beaches after Hurricane Sandy. It was an effort, Literal Society and others. And they said, you can't go out there. And I'm like, what are we going to do? And they said, follow us. So we literally followed them down to a couple of beaches that had been restored. So they were able to share information with the students about that process. And basically what's happening is the sand's getting just pushed back into the marsh. So we were there this spring, and it was very upsetting to see the beach at low tide, a lot of impingements, hard for horseshoe crabs. So Dr. Larry Niles said they need to replenish it again, but it's a costly endeavor. We've also, in the spring, stopped at the Village of Arts and Humanities in North Philadelphia. They have a lot of different things going on there. And again, a serendipitous encounter in 2015, Lily Yeh, who literally founded it, was back. And she was back to repaint the initial mural, which you see in the background. So we had an opportunity to get to talk with her. And then finally, we've been visiting the Palmerton zinc smelter site for many years. Again, I learned about it from a student on our MES program named Mark Folkman, who did his capstone looking at phytoremediation there. And the phytoremediation here is just keeping the metals in the ground. This was a zinc smelting operation that operated for about 80 years, 24/7. So sulfur dioxide killed the forest, and then there was deposition of heavy metals that have inhibited regeneration, and there's been tremendous amount of erosion. So this is back again in 2003, and the students loved walking through this moonscape. Some of the vegetation that was persistent was sour gum and sassafras, so you see islands of them, and there's some gray birch that's starting to come back, and some broom sedge. And here you can get a sense of just how much erosion has occurred. And so we would meet with John Euler. He worked for the Zinc Corporation of America. He had experience stabilizing slopes in the wake of the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. And the approach that he helped develop and implement was something called eco-loam. An eco-loam consisted of sewage sludge and fly ash mixed together with lime and potash. They brought up these spreader trucks from the Kentucky coal mines that would shoot it up and down, 66 miles of switchbacks that they carved into the slope above the eastern plant. So it was effective, but it had a lot of problematic elements, so they didn't use it more widely. And later, the Lehigh Gap Nature Center established on the western side of the Lehigh Gap, below on the opposite side of the western smelter, and there was a less intensive approach that was developed. And this involved amending the soils and then using warm season grasses to build basically a topsoil atop the contaminated layer. So Dan Kunkel was executive director there, who worked with the principal responsible party, and the students were able to learn about this approach. And this is an approach they've used more widely in the area. So this is in the springtime. It's beautiful to see all the flowers, migrating birds. We've seen black and white warblers coming through. And this past year, we were there again. And here's the group. In the background, you can see this hill. It's a little bit obscured, but that's a hill that's untreated. So the untreated areas have stayed very moonscapey. And I think this was the first year we got, I think, everybody up over the mountain. So this is you can go up over the mountain. So this is on the ridge top. You can look out to see the Pocono Plateau, which Anne had mentioned earlier in the day. And this just is a perfect spot perfect place to end the field class and just to end this talk, I think. But so visiting the sites along the regional transcript with landscape architecture students over the years has been an amazing experience for me, full of discovery and surprise and delight. And so I honestly celebrate the many students who work to understand the character of these landscapes by moving through them, writing about them, drawing them, assembling the field guide. And look forward to many more adventures in the field with this year's group and students of the future. So thank you very much.
Hi, we're almost there. We're almost there. And we've just had such a phenomenal day, so many things that we've learned together. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm going to try to keep it brief so that we can have that conversation that Catherine promised that we'd get to have a little bit before the keynote. So my name is Tessa. I work at Princeton University in the School of Public and International Affairs. And I want to talk to you about seeds. So the smallest of the building blocks of the landscape design, among the smallest, right? But even as we were walking in today, Elvin reminded me that within a seed is a universe. And one of the ways to think about that is to think that seeds, especially ancestral seeds, heirloom seeds that I get to work with through the seed farm, contain all of history. Right? They contain all of the wisdom of the plants that have lived, that have gone into creating the seed that we work with today. Every hand that saved it, or its predecessor, every choice or preference or selection that was made to bring us the plant that we get to enjoy from the seeds that we plant. And so one of the things that I'm hoping, I'm not a landscape designer or architect, I'm actually a humanist. I study stories and seeds and the way that they carry stories. But one of the things that I would just like you, those of you who do design work, to be thinking about is the role of the seed in the overall design practice, and where the seeds come from, what stories the seeds themselves hold, and how we can source seeds that are good relatives to the plants that are in the places that we're working. So I founded and direct a project called the Seed Farm. At the farm, we grow rare, culturally meaningful seeds with community collaborators who use the seed stock that we share back with them to further efforts in food sovereignty. I'm going to share a little bit about what I do, and then I'll set that in the context of the astronaut and the naturalist frames that we've been working with today, and then finally I'll just share a few closing thoughts about how we might all connect that to landscape design. So each season, we partner with community seed keeping organizations that share seeds with us, which they've identified as rare, culturally meaningful, and in need of cultivation. And sometimes the seeds are on the verge of extinction or threatened by dwindling seed stock. Other times there's an interest in adapting promising genetics to new regions and climates. We accept the seeds, grow them out, try to work with them in the same way that the seed keepers who shared them with us would, which means we get to learn a lot of different ways and approaches to agricultural practices. And then we return the full harvest back to them in the form of clean processed seed. While the seeds are in our stewardship, we also offer to leverage the resources of the university to answer questions of value to those community organizations. And these questions range from genetic and scientific to historical and archival, but they can also just simply ask us to use the power of observation and note-taking to document the life cycles of the plants. These are things that farmers who are at the edge of the profit margins, they don't have time to even just kind of sit and observe and document. And so sometimes that's the request from our community partners, and we're glad to do it. I want to share an example of what this looks like. So the seed farm is sort of a big tent under which lots of projects come, and because we don't decide what seeds are rare or culturally meaningful, the seeds are instead shared with us. The projects change and evolve, and they really are centered in the kinds of relationships, and we move as fast as sort of the speed of trust, we say. And so in some ways, there's no overarching design to the projects themselves because they grow and evolve and adapt. And one of the projects that I'd like to tell you about that has done that over the last 3 years is a project that we call the Nanticoke and Maycock Squash Revitalization Project. So I say that plants have people and places. And some of the seeds of those plants are considered relatives or ancestors by some people, particularly in indigenous communities. Here in the US and many places around the world, seeds have been separated from their people and places through historical trauma, migration, dispossession, or other hardship. Princeton University, like Penn, is located on land that is the traditional homeland of Lenape people. So at the seed farm, we've been really lucky to be able to work with seeds that originated in Lenape-Hoking, where they were tended, selected, and preserved by indigenous people over generations. Yet, through experiences with colonization, many of the seeds from Lenape-Hoking are not with Lenape people right now. They've ended up in small seed collections, seed banks, or in the hands of farmers and gardeners where they've been kept and cared for. There's a growing movement through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network to rematriate indigenous seeds to their communities and their families. And the Nanticoke and Maycock Squash Revitalization Project is one such effort. In 2021, a seed keeper in South Jersey shared with us seeds of the Nanticoke squash. That seed keeper is here in the photo in the middle in the maroon shirt with the hat on. His name is Nate Kleinman. He runs a project called the Experimental Farm Network, spends a bunch of time in Philly working with environmental efforts and things. And so he had been given some seeds of a Nanticoke squash. The Nanticoke squash is a winter squash. There's 3 varieties of squash, Maximo, Peppo, and Moschata. It's a Maxima squash. That's important in the seed-saving world because you can save one of each kind. But if I planted more than 1 Maxima at the farm, they'd cross. So I can have on the farm 1 Maxima, 1 Peppo, 1 Moschata. So the Maxima that we grow is this Nanticoke squash that Nate Kleinman shared with us. And we grew those seeds over the course of the season. And Nate, in that same year, was contacted by a woman named Courtney Street, who is in the purple sweater. Courtney had recently founded an organization in Delaware called the Native Roots Farm Foundation. Courtney's a member of the Nanticoke tribe there. And she heard of the Nanticoke squash, and she didn't know the Nanticoke squash, and she was interested in meeting it. So she reached out to Nate, and Nate said, "Oh, well, Tessa's growing it at the seed farm." And so we invited that season. So here in the corner is the squash planted as plants. This is a pile of Nanticoke squash and also some Long Island cheese pumpkins. But the Nanticoke squash is a diverse landrace variety of a winter squash. And so Nate said, "Courtney, why don't you come up and meet the squash that we're growing at the seed farm?" And so Courtney and one of her close collaborators, Carell, came up. And Carell works on language. She's an anthropologist of language, finishing her PhD at Rutgers. In fact, I think she's on fellowship here this semester, finishing in a dissertation, finishing fellowship. So we're standing in the kitchen. We're with a group of students from a class that I was teaching called Land and Story in Native America, and we are harvesting the seeds of the Nanticoke squash. And we're standing in the kitchen, and Nate is talking with Courtney and Carell about other seeds that folks have shared with him, and he says, there's another seed that I have that is a Lenape squash, and it is called the Maycock squash. And Carell, who's an anthropologist of language, says, "What?" And he says, "The Maycock squash." And she says, "Well, that's very much like macaque, which is the Nanticoke word for squash." And she said, "Tell me more about that squash." And he said, "Well, it is a squash the seeds were shared in the 1980s by a Nanticoke elder with one of his seed-keeping mentors." And she said, that's our squash. It's named, we knew the Nanticoke squash was our squash because it's called the Nanticoke squash. And now here's a squash. And so anyway, so then they wanted to meet the Maycock squash. So we planted, Nate had seeds from the Maycock squash, which we planted the following year at the farm. Now, the seeds of the Maycock squash that were shared with William Moyes Weaver, this mentor, were of the true landrace variety. They were shared by a Nanticoke elder who was trying to find someone who would help to keep these seeds alive and continue to regenerate them. And so she shared them, and she said that's the landrace variety. Again, this really diverse representation of a single plant variety. And William Moyes Weaver, a phenomenal and dedicated seed saver, but also informed by ideas of separation and categorization, started to pull out the different varieties and separate them. And so he'd collect up all the white oval squash and put them in one pile and save those seeds, and collect all of the squash that we've affectionately decided to call the Hershey Kiss-shaped squash in another pile and save those seeds. And over the years, he separated them out. So there were many different varieties, but kept separately, and they were producing true to type. And one of the things that we said when we started to get to know this squash was Courtney and Carell said, "Well, we'd like to return this squash to its landrace character," which is a lot of fun in the fields because it means we just get to plant them all together, the white blocky ones and the yellow Hershey Kiss-shaped ones, and just encourage them to cross-pollinate. And so that is what we're doing. You see here us harvesting seeds from the first year growing, which was last winter, and here we're drying them out in their separate categorizations so that we can mix them all up. So we took, 2 seeds from each type and put them all in envelopes that then Courtney, through Native Roots Farm Foundation, passes out through powwow circuit and other events in their communities. And this is a photo of the representation of those squash. And then, because that was going so well, Courtney invited us to be a partner in a sister in sister gardens of Three Sisters planting. So planting corn, beans, and squash together in Delaware and at the seed farm. We could grow silos full of these seeds for these varieties that really are in the hands of only a few people, but that wouldn't be revitalizing the crop. We actually wouldn't be saving the plants at all or making them relevant or meaningful here in Lenape-Hoking. That only happens through the connections with community people and ensuring that people fall in love with them again, get to know them again, like Courtney said when she said, I want to meet the squash. I don't know this squash. And so the other thing that we get to do together then is to prepare and share. And so here, up the top photo of the group is some of the students from the seed farm at powwow with Courtney passing out. Sometimes Courtney is passing out actual starts to the plants. Sometimes she's passing out seeds, but she's constantly passing them out and asking folks to write down their email addresses, because then in harvest season, she coordinates potlucks in which people come and share the prepared squash. The picture here, the fresh maycock squash and the dried squash, Nate came up and led students from one of my classes into a traditional spiralized cutting of the maycock squash. The way that Courtney tells the story, it would be in the spring, her people would start sort of in the interior of Delaware, and they would plant a winter squash, quite possibly the Nanticoke squash, and then they would migrate out to the shore for the summer. The winter squash would be left to grow in the interior of the state. They'd migrate out to the shore where they would plant the maycock squash, the summer squash, and enjoy seafood for the summer. They would harvest the maycock there, and then they would spiralize, cut it, dehydrate it, pack it in their sacks, and carry it back to the interior of the Delaware region, where they would then have 2 varieties of squash to eat over the winter. The winter squash that had grown in place, that they didn't have to carry or move, and the dried squash from the shoreline. And so we had the chance to produce a similar dehydrated squash in a traditional way, and then share it through a Three Sisters soup at an event called the Culinary Breeding Network's Variety Showcase, which is a really fun. It's like picture grocery store food samples, just like en masse, with plant breeders and chefs partnered up to make something delicious with foods you've never seen or tasted before. And so this is a really important process of a revitalization effort to make those seeds meaningful again and to help them find a home here again in Lenape-Hoking. I have some things to say about where this all fits in the astronaut and naturalist schema, because the seed farm model is very different. It often gets sort of enmeshed in the idea of a seed bank. We're not a seed bank. We are the opposite of a seed bank. But in the brevity of time, I'll just sort of say, there's this continuum of the kind of work that we're doing. The Svalbard Seed Vault, which is this massive effort in preserving genetic diversity and plant germplasm up in the frosty permafrost of Norway, is one version of seed saving. That's really like a black box, press the button here emergency situation in which we've experienced, quite an extensive extinction, and we hope that the plant genetics in that vault can help us. There's seed banks, which are larger efforts in collecting seeds. Sometimes they're dedicated to specific kinds of crops or collections, and sometimes, we have one, the USDA holds a seed bank in which we have plant plant material that we've been collecting for 200 years, held from all over the world. Seed libraries are a little smaller. They're often in your public library or your food co-op or something. Those are plants that are meaningful to people who are using them in their gardens and things. And the seed farm is even a little different than that. It's much smaller scale. It's just, we're growing maybe 20 varieties every year. But it's done with the intention of reintegrating those crops in meaningful ways back with their communities who've identified them as meaningful and wanted to continue a relationship with them. And so that just sets it a little bit from the very large macro to the very small building blocks of the work that I'm doing. And then, just to close, thinking about seeds and what that might mean, this kind of work, how that might translate to landscape design. And so seeds are everywhere. We eat them, we plant them, we blow them in the wind, but we also tend to take them for granted, and we consider them sometimes as interchangeable objects rather than these brilliant, wise entities that they are. Everything starts with good seed, though, and it's important to consider the role that an object as small as a seed can have in building resilience that supports diverse ecosystems, but also diverse cultural memories and survival into our landscapes. And so you all know better than most people, I assume, that the resilience of native plants and the role that they play in establishing a thriving landscape. So this is just a photo of some native plants that are planted at my farm. So the native plants have this brilliant ability to adapt to climatic and pest pressures because they've known these things in this place for a long time. That's why we call them native plants. The same is true for plants in our food system and for agrobiodiversity. We've come to rely en masse on the seeds of biotech crafted monocultures that diminish or completely annihilate the native crops that have long adapted and known our local landscapes. We can't simply insert biotech seeds into an organic or regenerative agricultural system. Using fewer chemicals and working more with nature on a farm is only as successful as the wisdom and the tenacity of the seeds who already know that landscape and can call up various genes that have been honed over a long array of evolution in place for survival. And so those old wise seeds, the old wise seeds of Lenape-Hoking in this place are the best tools that we have for having a smaller, more resilient, less chemically intensive food system. And some people in our communities still know those seeds or still want to know those seeds. And so the seed farm is working to build relationships to understand and support that wisdom and the maintenance of those crop varieties. Not to be forgotten, though, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle in seed evolution are wild crop relatives. A good example of this is maize. So modern-day Mexico is the world crop origin site of maize, where it evolved from a grass called teosinte. Teosinte continues to grow wild in Mexico, evolving in ways beyond developing ears of corn. And that maize continues to cross-pollinate with teosinte and its cousins, and that continued cross-pollination is essential to keep maize varieties on the cutting edge of nature. And so the other thing that I'm thinking about in the back of my mind that is a little bit bigger than individual ancestral or heirloom seed varieties is the way in which, as we design and terraform landscapes, we need to consider the seeds and think about this link in the chain of traditional wisdom that comes not only from the cultivated varieties that we have, but their wise ancestors, their wild relatives. And that's carried through plant genetics and the people who have known those seeds in those places for a long time. Seeds aren't merely plug and play building blocks. They have a reserve of evolved wisdom and resilience, and that reserve is something that we'd all be served well by in preserving. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thanks to all three of our naturalists. I couldn't help so thanks to Jared, Sally, and Tessa for your contributions. And I couldn't help but think a little bit about how you took us through these maps on the wall. So we kind of started there and have returned. And in some ways, the archive, that photograph of the course catalogs that brought us into like the oral tradition of this landscape program through the course catalog, I loved so much, and it was fascinating. So thank you for your deep dive up there on in the floors of Van Pelt. But thank you all so much. Our three speakers are all here and pretty much local, and Tessa's back on Wednesday, so I invite you to speak with them separately as opposed to having a conversation. We have a break until 7 p.m. I hope that everyone can stretch their legs and get some air, and take a quick break before we have Jeff Goodell join us. His talk is 7 to 8, and we'll have some food after that and a celebration. So we'll see you again in about half an hour. Thanks so much, everyone, and thank you to all our speakers from all three panels. Thanks so much.